also the executive publisher for Science Journals and a member of the Research America Board of Directors. You sense a theme here. We are very fortunate. Sudip served as science advisor and professional staff to the Senate Appropriations Committee from 2001 to 2009. Now, we are very fortunate indeed that today's discussion will be moderated by Laura Barón Lopez, White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. You can read more about our speakers in the bio document we have at the registration desk and linked online. Thank you again, everyone, for being here today. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Laura. Thank you. Check, check.
Well, first, before we go to the panel, I'm just going to give. Oh. Before we go to the panel, though, I'm just going to give us a little brief update on where everything stands, because as many of you know, we still don't know what the balance of power is going to be in Congress as of this morning. So last I checked, we don't know who is going to control the House. Right now, Republicans have 217 seats, so they are one seat away from the majority, but it is going to be a much more narrow majority than I think almost everyone anticipated. And so it's as well in the Senate. Democrats are now going to keep control of the House. That was declared on over this weekend, and again, there is still an outstanding race. Georgia, just like 2020, and ultimately that could either give Democrats a 51-seat majority or leave the Senate again split 50-50 with Vice President Kamala Harris breaking a lot of those ties. As many of you know, there was no red wave that prognosticators and many current Republican politicians predicted. And if you were watching the NewsHour, I'd like to think that you would have maybe been more prepared for the fact that there was not going to be a huge red wave, because in my reporting it was very clear that healthcare was something that was top of mind for a lot of voters, particularly abortion access and reproductive rights. And there were 5 states that had abortion access on the ballot, and in all 5 of those states, voters either voted to expand abortion access and contraceptive access, or they defeated measures that would have restricted that access. So across the board, pro-abortion rights folks ended up succeeding, and also we saw that South Dakota expanded Medicaid access, one of the latest states to do that. Just a few quick data points before we get going that I think help really wrap up what happened this election cycle. Abortion access was clearly something that was front and center for many voters, particularly young voters, who really ended up breaking for Democrats. 18 to 29-year-olds, 44% said that abortion was their top issue, and 24% of voters cited abortion, not 18 to 29-year-olds, 24% of voters across the board cited abortion as the deciding vote for them, and they broke heavily for Democrats. So I think that you saw inflation and abortion really dueling there. Of course, we're going to get into much more than that. We're going to get into what all of this means, the balance of power means for health, for science, and technology. And so with that, we are going to start.
Laura, while you're getting that, I want to make an announcement about the election. If anybody has not had enough or seen enough TV commercials, move to Atlanta. So over the next month, you'll get your fill.
That's right, and the runoff there will be December 6th, so you guys don't have to wait till January anymore, but still quite a few more weeks left of the election. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, for our panelists. Charlie, I'd like to start with you. So as I just outlined, we don't know yet what the balance of power is going to be in the House, but
cameras okay? Oh, good. There we go. Few things. Yeah, there will be an election, I believe, later today. Kevin McCarthy will get probably a strong majority of the House Republican Conference vote. Does he have 218 votes? I think the answer to that question is no. Will he have 218 votes on January 3rd? I don't think anybody knows right now. He's going to be spending, I suspect, every waking hour between now and then to secure those votes. I would not be surprised if he does not get it. I just, having went through the 2015 experience when John Boehner stepped down and then Kevin McCarthy attempted to, you may recall the events, largely the Freedom Caucus, the hard right of the Republican House membership, basically prevented him from ascending. And that put the House in turmoil until Paul Ryan stepped up, and then there were 218 votes for him. And so the people who are going to try to take down Kevin McCarthy, I don't know that they're necessarily very strategic. In other words, the people will say, well, who's the alternative? I don't think they really have one, nor do they really care.
He can't lose 3. Unless the Democrats want to vote for him, but I kind of don't think that's going to happen. So that's the dynamic you got right now, and he is being squeezed, again, by the hard right flank, to make all sorts of concessions on various rules changes. So the demands are pretty outrageous, frankly. It's a real political shakedown. They want to change, one of the rules changes was to make it easier to vacate the chair. That is, one member could go to the floor and say, I want to remove the speaker, and that's what Meadows did to Boehner back in 2015. But that would be like, handing the noose to your opponents and say, here, why don't you just drape it around my neck? I mean, no, he could never agree to that. The other demand that they want to put in the rule, something to the effect that you would need a majority of the majority to pass any legislation. I mean, that's, again, I would think it's a non-starter. So I don't know how he gets there, because the more concessions he makes, to the hard right, is going to agitate a lot of his other members who are going to be very much against these changes. So right now, I don't think he's got the votes. He might get there. Who knows what's going to happen, but I wouldn't be shocked if he did not.
And we're not even talking about legislation yet, or the ability to actually.
By the way, this is a two-step dance, by the way, because he's being asked to make changes first, and then come the rules changes. So I could see some members saying to Kevin McCarthy, who don't like what the hard right is doing here, saying, hey, I'll vote for you for speaker, Kevin, but but I'm not going to vote for those rules changes.
So I'll take a quick contrarian. I would agree that Kevin won't get the majority, but it'll be next time. He will.
We need no.
Okay.
These mics are a little too.
Hello, okay. I think that Kevin won't get it, but it'll be the next time. I think he'll make whatever compromises, concessions that's necessary this time around, and it'll just be awful. Democrats' first and major wish was that we kept the majority. The second wish was, if we didn't, it would be very small and miserable. And I think that it's going to be very hard to govern these next 2 years.
Of course, I agree. Do you think he'll get the majority?
I think he'll stand on his head, whatever it takes, because of what you pointed out, there really isn't a clear alternative.
So you think he'll get the speakership this time?
I think so. I mean,
I think he can get it too. I just don't see it today. That's all I'm saying.
It'll be
And it may take a few rounds on the floor. Yeah. So, but the Democratic side, Mara, I want to get to that. House and Senate Democrats, it appears Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer will stay as the leader there. But just today I was checking in with some of my, press corps colleagues on the Hill, and it looks like there's a little bit of itching for Nancy Pelosi to potentially step aside, even though the margin looks really narrow right now in the House.
Yeah, I think
I think the House is a little bit like the upside down world right now, where the party that has taken control is feeling demoralized and in disarray, and the party that has just lost control is feeling more unified and buoyant. So I saw there was a report this morning that outside of a Democratic caucus meeting, there were lots of cheering and people feeling sort of optimistic. You know, Pelosi, I take her at her word that she said she wouldn't run for speaker again. I know there's a lot of pressure for her to perhaps run for leadership, to be the minority leader at a Republican-controlled House. You know, I think there are people standing in the wings who are ready to run for these positions, so I think that would be a hard thing for her to do at this point. You know, obviously in the Senate, things are status quo, and they could increase their majority, which nobody ever would have been able to predict. But we're a week out from the election, so the other thing I will say is that Republicans who are feeling a little bit demoralized about, not meeting expectations in the election will soon be taking gavels back and asserting their power, and that will help to sort of put the election in the rear view, and I think sort of give leadership a little bit more of a unified caucus.
Bart, you look like you maybe wanted to jump in there.
I would just add that I think what Nancy Pelosi said was, I'm not going to run unless you want me to. And
The mic is not on.
Okay, I think what she said was, I'm not going, it was a little squishy. I'm not going to run for another term unless you want me to. And she's still the most powerful figure in the Democratic Party in the House. And in my opinion, the most effective speaker. I mean, I served with Tip O'Neill through the others or knew them. She's just by far the most effective. But there, with Paul, with what happened there, going back into the minority, I think ultimately what she will do is take a big cheer and step aside, knowing that her seat will stay Democratic with a special election. But she's going to want to know how she gets them lined up. But she's going to be a player. She can't help it. She wants to be in there.
Well, if that's what happens, Bart, then she won't have listened to President Biden. I think reportedly he did ask her if she could stick around because, of course, he really sees her as a key ally there in the House, particularly as he's trying to get his agenda done. But before we get to what could possibly pass in terms of health and science, or Charlie, I just wanted to ask you, how does all of this, the narrow margins in the House, Bart, you could jump in here too, but how the narrow margins in the House, the narrow Senate majority, impact actual deal making and the ability to get anything done?
Well, I mean, I think it encourages bipartisanship. We already saw in the last, speaking about science funding, we saw in the last year, really a bipartisan consensus around chips and science. And now we need to finish the job in terms of funding, the science portion of that. And I believe there's room for bipartisanship on these issues, as there has been traditionally. But in a narrow, majority, you really do have to find ways to work across the aisle. And I think we'll see that in the appropriations process. There's, we're going to have a historic moment here where the leads of both the Senate and House Appropriations Committees are all women for the first time ever. And so I think that will be helpful in many ways. Both parties want to highlight women in leadership. You want them to succeed if you're going to highlight them. So hopefully those are relationships that have been good across the aisle, and I'm hopeful that will continue.
I agree that you'll see bipartisanship, but it will be painful. It'll be really painful. And the Senate, look, I was in the House for nearly 14 years, and so one thing I learned a long time ago was that the Senate is always going to force the House to eat whatever they send them, because the Senate has the capacity to pass a bipartisan bill, because they usually need 60 votes on most things. And if they can get over 60 votes on something, they send it back to the House. It's pretty hard for the House not to eat it or take it up. That's because the House is too undisciplined. It will send over very partisan pieces of legislation. I always said to my colleagues in the House, if you want the Senate to eat something that you send them, you need to have 300 votes, okay, or a big, strong majority, bipartisan majority. That's how you do that. If you don't have the discipline to pass a bill in a bipartisan way, well then, get ready to let the Senate write the bills for you, and then complain when you have to vote for them. So that's what the reality is, but it's going to be difficult, though. Just think about, let's take the debt ceiling. Democrats are smart about this. They'll clean that off the decks in between now and the time they hand the gavel over to the Republican speaker, if it's Kevin McCarthy or whoever. They would be smart to get rid of that thing now, because next year it's going to be brutal. You'll need some Republican votes, and you'll need a whole bunch of Democratic votes, but there'll be all sorts of pressure and leverage in that process. Just the spending bills, you'll need 60 votes. That will also be a challenge. I think they'll probably get there most of the time. But this will be a real problem, though, for whoever the Republican speaker is. Because that speaker is going to have to cut deals with the minority member in his conference or caucus and work with Democrats, and of course get Joe Biden, Democrat, to sign the bills and the law. So whoever that speaker is going to be taking it on the chin from those people right now who are making those outrageous demands on him in order to become speaker. Becoming speaker is easier than holding on to the job these days. Kind of like the UK.
So let's get to, well, first the lame duck. Just what's striking is that in this election, exit polls found that just 2% of respondents said that the pandemic was the most important issue facing the country. But President Biden is trying to make another push for COVID-19 funding for vaccines, for treatments, which was shot down prior to the election. I think it's some $10 billion that he's looking for. How important is that funding as the country continues to battle the pandemic?
That funding is very important. We've created vaccines, we've created some small molecule drugs. The challenge is that this will evolve. This will evolve over time. And so the projects that are being put forward, this new funding, are about how do you deal with that next wave? How do you create surveillance systems around the world? How do you create vaccines for the next round of mutation? And also how do you think about the next pandemic? Not just COVID, but whatever the next thing is. And this is preparation work that we should have done before. And now that we've had a pandemic, my goodness, we should see the need for it. We should see the need for it now more than ever because we know that it'll come again. That said, with 2% of the population saying that it's important, it doesn't give me a lot of hope that we're going to learn from that lesson. And so I am concerned that money is at this moment a dream, because without, as Mary Woolley likes to quote Abraham Lincoln, without popular support, nothing is possible. And I'm butchering that quote, but we don't have public support. With only 2%, nobody's going to pass those extra billions of dollars for COVID.
Do you think part of why there is not that public support is because there haven't been enough campaigns or education campaigns? Or do you want to jump into?
I think there's probably two reasons. This says I am. Okay, here we go.
There we go.
There is a spending fatigue in this country right now.
I think it's off.
I may just yell.
Yeah, I would just leave the mic on. Don't turn it off.
Okay. There's a spending fatigue in the country. It seems like every week it's $1 billion for Ukraine, it's a few $1 billion for student aid, bam, 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 bam. And so I think that is a part of the problem. And also, President Biden said we're past it a while back. So I think at the end of the day, and I think Republicans want to take advantage of this spending fatigue and be what they would call fiscally responsible. And I think at the end of the day, there'll be something passed, but it'll be pushed down. It won't be the kind of numbers that we had talked about.
So what type of science and research issues do you think the Congress can actually tackle next?
We do have to pass this FY23 appropriations bill, and that contains an extraordinary amount of science in it. Almost $200 billion worth of research and development is in there. And there's broad-based support for that, and you saw that in the CHIPS and Science Act. I think that when you talk to individual members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, they will tell you how much they support the sciences in that bill. The challenge becomes the overall package. If it was just science all by itself, there's a lot of bipartisan support. When you have a top-line number that folks don't agree upon between the houses and then also between the parties, that number's going to come down, and it has to come from somewhere. And when you're $200 billion of $1.2 trillion in spending, some of it has to come from that. You know, it's a big proportion of discretionary spending is on research and development. And so the challenge becomes, even though there's political support, there's popular support, because of the mechanisms of how you get it through Congress, we have a lot of battles to fight.
And part of this, of course, is a new NIH director. So, which with the Senate staying in Democratic hands, Democrats seem to be hopeful that a new NIH director will actually be easier to confirm now. Maura, what do you make of that, and if that's something that Democrats will be doing in the near term?
Well, I think, NIH, CDC, you've got a lot of agencies that have become political that haven't been political historically. And so with Republicans taking control of the House, you could see oversight, you could see, on the appropriations side, but also oversight committee in terms of CDC. I do think that historically, health research has been something that has had broad bipartisan support. And when you talk about, back to Mary saying that having popular support is important, we have very well organized groups that advocate on behalf of patients, and they're incredibly powerful because they bring a personal story to the table. And so I think that those stories and those people will be incredibly important as we look to fund those priorities going forward.
Just to be concrete about it, the Senate staying Democratic means that it's much more likely that we'll have an NIH director sooner rather than later, even later. It doesn't mean it's going to be imminent, because these are tough jobs to fill. And this, I think, is something that we should all appreciate as a scientific enterprise. These are jobs that in the past people would have killed for. To be the director of the NIH, the director of the CDC. These are wonderful, wonderful jobs to help lead the scientific enterprise and lead in discovery. And what we've now done is we've made these jobs terrible. They're horrible. Right now, whoever takes over the job as NIH director is going to be facing hearing after hearing, oversight that is look, oversight is important. We have to do it. But is it the kind of oversight that is fair and thoughtful and is to be built around creating new legislation that will drive the scientific enterprise forward and create discovery for health? Or is it the kind of oversight that's meant to score points?
You mean more from House Republicans?
Yeah. I think that's a worry.
Just one quick thing on spending. Look, as has been stated and Maura said, medical research has been robustly funded in recent years. You've got Rosa DeLauro and Tom Cole in the House, you have Lloyd Blunt, Patty Murray in the Senate. Blunt's gone now, but nevertheless, Cole and DeLauro, I assume, will probably still be overseeing labor health funding, and you should be in pretty good shape. You're at least on medical research. I can't speak to the other areas right now of scientific research, but at least there you should be okay. But your biggest problem is going to be this: if they can't come to spending agreements, then you're going to get a continuing resolution, everything's going to get flat funded. That's what you have to be worried about right now. Any type of stalemate that doesn't allow for a robust appropriations process.
So does that mean essentially that, research and development for a universal influenza vaccine, is that not going to be really possible, the funding for something like that, given the makeup of the Senate and the House?
The big dollars that were in pandemic preparedness are not going to allow that. Now, there is funding in the base budget of the National Institutes of Health, and we've been working on universal vaccines, the technology behind it, for a long time. But the big push to do it in an applied way to get to big solutions, that gets harder with the core funding of the NIH, because a lot of that's spoken for. There's other research ongoing, and it's very hard to sort of change directions and to make it apply. The creation of ARPA-H gives you some hope that there's potential for activities like that, but that's yet to be determined. We don't know yet what the priorities are.
Bart, how do you think that science funding is going to actually fare under this new Congress?
Well, if you haven't determined already, I'm a little bit of a pessimist here. I think it's going to be a mess for the next 2 years. I think that because, this election is, well, for some, it's all over with by a few days, but the next one's 2 years away. President or former President Trump supposedly is going to announce re-election.
Tonight.
You're going to see Democrats starting to do the same. The Congress would be made up of messaging type of things. I hate to say it, but I think, if you're in the minority, the way you think you get back to the majority is not let the majority get anything done. I think that the Democrats are going to do, to some extent, what the Republicans did to them and try to stop things from, going forward. So I think you've got a mess. There's some good news, though. Budget starts with the president. I think you'll see President Biden have some good numbers. As Charlie said, the spending bills aren't supposed to start in the Senate, but by de facto, to a great extent, they may not start there, but they wind up sort of ending there. And so you'll try to have some good numbers. But you've got to keep in mind, there's a lot of money in the pot right now. Now, it doesn't always line up with what we need, and we need to have continuity, but there's a lot of money there. And so I think one of the good news is about the Senate having a majority of Democrats is that Biden will be able to get his appointments through now. And you've got to have somebody writing the checks. And so that's, with the money that's already there. So, I think that's going to be good news. Certainly, as I think Charlie and Maura pointed out, in the health area, you can put a face on it. And you can see, your Aunt Millie has Alzheimer's. So health is going to be easier. I think that in the science area, it's going to be more difficult, and particularly to line up the different pots. And now the good news there, and I hate to use the word enemy, but it's the the enemy of each other is you mentioned friends. China is the big existential threat in terms of economic, in terms of military concerns. So that's going to be the common denominators that Democrats and Republicans can agree upon. And if you see them come out with another quantum computing success, other computation, then there'll be a combined effort to say, we've got to stop that. Plus, I think, I don't want to cause them trouble, but one of the secret weapons is Frank Lucas. I think Frank's going to be chairman of the science committee. Frank is a solid fellow. He can only go as far as his caucus will let him, but he will go as far as they will let him in trying to cooperate in matching up funding.
And we're talking about in the House specifically, just so people are aware. And that brings me to, the CHIPS and Science Act, which is that, is there anything else in terms of research priorities that were left on the table there, the negotiating table, that could be addressed? I mean, do you think that the House Republicans will actually be supportive of adding to that? Mark, do you want to, or
What I'll say there is, 2 years ago, the House Republicans put out a China Task Force report. And in that report, they very clearly, explicitly say that we should be doubling research and development funding over 10 years. The House Republicans, and I think that's, Mr. Lucas was on that committee, but it included all of the House leadership. So the House Republicans are on record wanting to double research and development in this country. And I think that's a really good sign. The challenge becomes, as has been noted, that getting a spending bill passed is really hard. Are there other things outside of CHIPS and Science? Actually, many of the things that we've been wanting over the last 10 years are included as authorization legislation inside of CHIPS and Science. The funding is not there though, and that's where we're going to be in trouble. We have a framework for all these programs, but we don't have the money yet. And so we have to get it through appropriations, and that's going to be the biggest challenge.
Yeah, the one other place I would say there will be some opportunity is on the defense bill, NDAA, which is, a bill that will pass. And so many times when you find yourself frustrated at the approach process, you're looking to get some authorizing language in bills that you know are going to pass, and that's a place where a lot of times people will do demonstration projects or get their foot in the door on some funding priorities. And we could see if we don't get a full omnibus, and we're stymied, you might get a minibus with some of the appropriations bills that are passing. Defense is always one of the ones that would be in that smaller group that passes.
right, that's what we call must-pass bills. Yeah, go ahead.
Look, I just want to say a good word about Frank Lucas. He's a big rancher from western Oklahoma. He is not a shrinking violet. He is a guy who will take on people who don't want to go. I've watched him over the years. and he can push back pretty hard, and he can be very effective, so I want to put a good word in for him. But I am cynical, like everybody else, about Washington, but I would do, one of the reasons I really enjoyed being on the Appropriations Committee, it was the only committee in Washington that actually had to do something every single year, as we had to fund the government. All the other committees, no disrespect, Bart, the science and other committees, but every other committee, though, they'd be nice if they got something done, but, the world's not gonna end if they don't. And so that's where the game is played in these spending bills. It always is. And nice thing about it is, as advocates for science, again, it's a big enterprise, I'm not gonna get into everything, ARPA-E, and DOD research funding, of course, NIH, NSF, there's funding everywhere. But, these subcommittees on the appropriations committees matter. And it all depends on what kind of allocations they get. Whatever that budget agreement is, whatever the top line number is, and they divide it up 12 different ways, not equal, but 12 ways. And then that allocation matters. And I just know that at least having served on the Labor Rate Subcommittee, Tom Cole and Rosa DeLauro, they both found NIH funding to be a top priority, and they made it one. And, we could sit there and then they have a negotiation. I was a subcommittee chairman of another subcommittee, and we have negotiations with the Senate, but if these four people come to an agreement, which is not always that difficult to do in the appropriations process, you can do really well. Even though there's a lot of other bad things happening, maybe on the authorization side, or just not occurring, you can still do well in the funding. So it depends on who's sitting in those chairs and what your allocation is going to be.
So earlier, Sudhir, you mentioned the potential for investigations or the potential for oversight on the House side, but more I wanted to ask you about on the Senate side, because if Democrats win the Georgia seat and they have a 51-seat majority, that can come with subpoena power, that can come with more investigative power in their committees. Do any of you see how that could potentially be used, whether it's for COVID-19 pandemic or others, in a way that they haven't had that power before in the past 2 years?
Yeah, I don't think that they have voiced that as a priority in the same way that Republicans have in the House. But there may, depending on what Republicans do, every action has a reaction. There may be some sort of reaction that happens in the Senate. So it's a really good question. I haven't seen anybody sort of voice what that might look like. But, their primary goal is still going to be like, can we get a bunch of judges through? Can we, help the president, with his agenda, his budget? They'll be trying to do all of that. So it's still it's a lot of work, and it's going to be very difficult. 50 votes was difficult. 51 votes is still difficult. It's a small, majority. So.
Before we leave the House spending, or the House oversight, we can predict a lot of things, but the only thing we can really predict with certainty is that there's going to be a lot of ugly House oversight. And oversight really isn't probably the right term. It'll be indictments. It'll be payback. It'll be messaging for the next Congress. If I was poor old Hunter Biden, I'd just go surrender right now. It's like, it's really going to be awful. And where it's going to bleed over to science is there's going to be a lot of gotcha. There's going to be an effort to find the next cylinder. And when I say cylinder, you might remember it was funding for a solar project that in the long term, cylinder made money. In the better term, the whole package made money. But early on, it didn't look so good. So the Republicans are going to try to find waste, fraud, and abuse in any way they can in any of these research projects. So what's the byproduct of that? If you are a project manager, you're going to be a little more shy about trying to get the money out the door. And you're going to be more cautious. And by definition, they should be having some failures because you're not really, stepping up if you don't have some. You don't want them, but, there's got to be failures if you're really pushing out there. So I think it's going to make the funding more difficult and more conservative and some of these really generous pots of money that are already out there.
And it could also, to your point earlier, make it harder to find people to fill jobs, right? Because, I mean, Senator Rand Paul, I know that Republicans aren't going to control the Senate, but he had said that he wanted to go after Anthony Fauci.
Yeah.
So some of this, I agree with Bart that you have to be really prepared for aggressive oversight, but with such a small majority in the House, I'm wondering if there might not be a little bit of a tempering effect on some of the House Republicans. I mean, if they want to go after Hunter Biden's laptop, I mean, there might be political consequences for that. I think the public, they didn't do well in the elections, Republicans, they didn't meet expectations. And do they really want to do things that might upset the American people or proceed on impeachment of Joe Biden without any crimes being committed? Or these, they can get real aggressive, but there could be real political consequences for that. So I'm just starting to think, if I'm whoever the speaker is going to be, if it's McCarthy, I would want to tamp down some of these more overly exuberant, exotic members, who want to go all out and just get some clicks on social media and get on Fox News or whatever they want to do. This isn't necessarily going to help them hold on to their majority.
I'm worried though, in that it can move them towards the science. So for example, lab origin of COVID versus zoonotic origin, right? We've published papers here in our journal Science that they don't establish absolutely, but they sure say, or the preponderance of the evidence, that this is a zoonotic disease. That's the origin of the disease, and that it isn't a lab origin. But you can always find a scientist somewhere who will say that it's lab origin. And we as scientists look at it and say, well, where's the peer-reviewed paper? And that's where we're going to have our arguments. But when you have a hearing, you have a wonderful scientist on one side, and then you've got somebody else, and it looks like it's equal. And that concerns me as a scientist and as someone who works in science policy, is that we can create a lot of misinformation in a hearing process that is different from whenever you're putting papers through the peer review process and having a real scientific argument. We scientists want to argue, but we want to do it in a crucible that is peer reviewed, not in the spotlight of a Senate hearing or a House hearing.
You also see some of that playing out in announcements by some Republicans that they want to go after ESG standards, so you get into climate science there. So, there are other places where it could bleed over into science and research.
So we do have to start the Q&A very soon. I just did have one more question for all of you, but before I get to that, it sounds like, you guys can all nod or say yes very quickly, it's going to be very messy the next 2 years. There maybe will be more funding, maybe not. Funding is going to be very difficult for a lot of these priorities. It sounds like there isn't a definitive yes on whether or not there will be more funding for boosters and COVID vaccines and any of that, right? Okay, that's our synopsis right now, not to give you too bleak of an outlook for the next 2 years.
Well, although you did see that the public health emergency has been extended by 2 months, so that gives the executive branch some powers over some of that.
Okay, and then very quickly, just a question for all of you. What message do you think advocates could have when they're trying to talk to Democrats and Republicans in this new Congress, specifically on health and medical research? Charlie,
Yeah, well, look, you guys they already do a terrific job. All those folks who are advocating for Alzheimer's research or colon cancer research, they're well organized, they're good. I don't think health research or medical research is going to be your problem. I think you've got some friends in key positions, you're well organized in terms of how you approach them. So I think the sky is blue in that regard. Your enemy is going to be the, what's the allocation that they're going to have, how much money do they actually have to work with. Now, the other areas of research, I'll leave it to my colleagues here to try to determine what the chances are of getting more funding there. That'd probably be more difficult, but I think on medical and health research, you're in good shape.
Yeah, I think in terms of speaking to a new Republican majority in the House, really focusing on economic competitiveness with China, national security priorities, really sort of focusing in on the areas that they've really voiced concern about in terms of our ability to compete.
I think both those answers are exactly right. We've got to make sure that we have an allocation that allows NIH to be funded at levels that I think lots of members of Congress want to see it funded at. And the only way to get to that allocation is with this argument related to competitiveness. We've seen it over and over again. It's the basis of that report from the House Republicans.
I agree with all that. Let me add one more piece. And that is all the folks that are here and watching, the outside advocates. You really going to play a critical role in that to get things through this time. I think the combination is having a Democrat and Republican champion and putting a face on it. And that's what you can do, whether it is Alzheimer's or whether it is quantum computing. You're going to have put a face on it from folks back home, talking to their members, talking through their associations, talking to those champions, and giving them the ammunition to get something done. So you're going to be a very important part of this process in the coming year.
Great, thank you. And now we'll take our first question from the audience.
Sudha, can you discuss the 2023 priorities of the Science and Tech Action Committee, on which you and Mary Woolley serve as co-chairs, and how will you build on the progress made with the passage of the CHIPS and Science Bill?
Great, thank you. The Science and Technology Action Committee, for those of you who don't know, is a group of 23 leaders in academia, in industry, in business, and they've come together really on their own time to say this is a national priority. Science and technology are a national priority. We had three things that we wanted to see accomplished. One was seeing the science advisor become a member of the cabinet. That happened. We wanted to see more coordination of our science agencies on the big problems, things like climate change, energy storage. We are seeing the beginnings of that coordination. There's a framework for it in the CHIPS and Science Act. And the third piece was to see funding double to about 1.4% of GDP. Here, when it comes to the stack, the big thing that we're trying to accomplish is making sure that overall discretionary spending level for FY23 remains high enough to enact the increases in NIH, NSF, ARPA-H, DOE, make sure that those allocations are high enough to keep those increases. And that's going to be a hard sell here at the end of this year.
I think that was a softball for Sudha. Good job,
Okay, next question.
Bart, can you give us some of your thoughts on the prospects for ARPA-H next year? Maybe more funding?
Well, I know that maybe that everybody here, that if you could write ARPA-H the way you wanted to, it would be a little bit different than the way it came out. But I think Anna Eshoo really did a good job in trying to come out with a bipartisan bill so that there's not an immediate effort to try to undo it. So I don't think really the authorization this coming year is the important thing. The important thing is getting it set up right. With, as some of you know, ARPA-E was my legislation, and it was the culture and the structure that was established up front that made it successful. Now, ARPA-H, to a great extent, just photocopied a lot of that structure there. So I think getting it right here this first year or two out is the important part.
Go ahead.
As an advocate for environmental research, I was heartened to hear Mr. Dent's sense that we're actually in decent shape relative to where we could be. But I was curious, in your experience as a subcommittee chair, if the investigations in energy and commerce, for example, are not tempered, as one might hope, but more robust, and want to slime NIH on any number of topics, what effect would that have on Tom Cole's avowed interest in funding NIH? When you were in the case of running a subcommittee, did you ever have a case where your authorizer was creating issues that then would have an effect that would make it harder for you? And I'd be also interested in others in the panel who would serve for members who were in those cases. If the authorizers are after you, will it have much effect on Tom Cole, or is he likely to be able to continue to support them?
That's a really good question. When I was a subcommittee chair for military construction and VA, I tried to work closely with my authorizing counterpart to make sure we were kind of on the same wavelength. But to be honest, there wasn't as much coordination as you would think. And I'll take you back to the Cures Act that my good friend Fred Upton and others, Diane DeGette, and a whole bunch were working very hard on that. It was great legislation, but we always said on the Appropriations Committee, Labor Age, hope they get it. Hope they do it, but you know what? We know what we're going to do here. And we're going to take care of medical research funding, no matter what they do. they're gonna authorize, but we're the ones who control the purse strings. So, you know, I'm hoping that they don't get overly aggressive on NIH, but I think many members, though, and certainly the appropriators do appreciate the mission of the NIH and the ongoing research, notwithstanding whatever issues some of them might have with Dr. Fauci over the pandemic. I think most of them recognize that medical research funding has to continue, and I don't think that would dissuade Tom Cole, because I think he's fully committed.
Do you have a follow-up, or anyone else want to add?
Just Democrats, Republicans, and appropriators, and I think that still holds true, but it's harder these days, right? Appropriations is not as independent as it was even 5 years ago, and certainly not as much as it was 20 years ago. And so I do think that, especially with a very slim majority, there's risk there. There is risk there, and I think you're right to point it out, Richard.
Yeah, by the way, appropriators are used to getting beaten up by their own parties for doing things. They have to end up cutting deals because they have to get something done. But that's the beautiful part of being an appropriator. You're going to upset some of your own members because you want to get a bill done and you just take the flak and move forward.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is that, you know, it's a self-selected group, so people who become appropriators want to use that power. They're good with spending money if it's spent in the right ways, and as we've said many times today, historically, a lot of science research has been bipartisan, and those relationships across the aisle, whether it be with Rosa and Tom or in the Senate, are really, really important. So I think they win the day.
Yeah, you got a new subcommittee chair in the Senate for Labor Aid, so, I mean, a ranking member, I should say.
Yeah.
So, and Roy Blunt, of course, is very supportive, and her successor is as well.
We're going to miss Roy Blunt.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Karen Gorleski. I'm the CEO of the American Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. Thanks to Research America and AAAS for giving us this opportunity. So the diseases that the society that I run care about aren't the diseases of Alzheimer's, cancer, diabetes. This is malaria, it's dengue, it's parasitic diseases, which have taken a huge hit during these last couple of years because of the drop of focus on regular ongoing efforts outside areas that anybody comes across. We don't have legions of survivors of cancer, diabetes, be able to go up to the Hill. However, our members are predominantly from our NIH researchers, or they're at the President's Malaria Initiative at USAID, they're CDC. The challenge we have, and it's really, I think, getting ramped up, is one, this incredible debt that the country has taken on for all good reasons, but it's still there. And our work is global. And increasingly working with people in other countries is seen as, maybe not quite as patriotic as it should be, or that we could do it all on our own because we're America. What are the suggestions from the panel on how to address this in some really significant ways? We absolutely need this global scientific open discourse.
There's actually some real excitement here, and I know you know this. A lot of the technology development that's happened for COVID is wonderful for many, many diseases, including infectious disease and mosquito-borne disease. So there's opportunity, scientific opportunity there. And I've heard the folks at NIH talk about it themselves. So I think that is an opportunity. When it comes to making sure that we continue to have global collaboration, infectious disease pays no attention to borders. At all. There's a dengue epidemic going on in South America and in Cuba, which is 90 miles away from Miami. We are facing, we're going to see that in this country very soon. I think making sure that folks realize that is going to be extremely important on the Hill, that this is coming, and it's coming because of climate change. But then also making sure that in the executive branch side, ensuring that there is coordination of NIH, of CDC, of others, to say that we can apply some of these new technologies to the diseases that we know are coming because of climate change. It's a start.
Well, I hope that Congress shares that opinion. Certainly some do, but you would think that after COVID, we're not at the end of COVID, but you would think that that has awakened people's understanding of what a globally interconnected world we do have. And until I took this job, I understood it intellectually. I really see it, and I thought, oh, good, now everybody else is gonna see it. No, not quite yet.
The only thing I'd add to that answer is that I'm actually very worried that, my day job, I run the Aspen Institute Congressional Program. We try to help members kind of develop, more of an internationalist view on a lot of issues. And I do worry that in the Congress and across the country that there is a very strong isolationist, protectionist element, nativist element. And I think that we are not, that there are, a lot of members need some help on how to engage on these types of global or international issues more constructively. I think that is a really big problem right now, because it's very easy for members of Congress of either party, frankly, to say, I'll take care, we got problems here, really, do we need to be so engaged over there? How does it really affect me? And that's an argument, and frankly, it's embraced by a lot of their constituents. So, that's the challenge. It's a constant education process for members, why they need to be engaged globally, not just, it's all sorts of internationals, whether it's NATO or the WHO, whatever it is, why we do this and why it's important. I don't think we've done a very good job explaining why we do what we do globally. I think it's lost, given all the other priorities that members deal with.
That's a great point. And, on tropical disease in particular, and infectious disease, surveillance, when we wanted to understand which mutants are actually making their way into the population, we have to go to South Africa, we have to go to the UK, because they have much better surveillance systems than we have. We are completely blind to these things in our country. And it's an embarrassment. It's an international embarrassment that we have to rely on. The reason it's called the South African variant is because they actually can sequence and know what's out there. We just don't know. We're blind.
And that brings up the issue that there needs to be more labs in Africa, so they don't have to do, send samples to a place that's far away or send it back to CDC or NIH. So
that actually also gets to a question I wasn't able to ask earlier, which was about the fact that Dr. Fauci has proposed funding for the study of disease families. Is that something that actually you think could happen in the coming Congress or no? I know.
I wish there was political will. I'm an eternal optimist, so I will never say never. And it's a wonderful scientific plan, right? To look at the families of viruses that are the most likely to lead to the next pandemic, and to go ahead and have vaccine candidates ready for those ahead of time, so that we can actually be faster than 1 year into a vaccine in the next pandemic. It's a wonderful scientific idea. That 2% of the population that sees it as a problem is what tells me that even I, the optimist, don't think that it's going to happen this year.
Go ahead.
Hi, sorry, I'm very short. I have a question that something that I saw in the pandemic where political leaders, doesn't matter which side of the spectrum you are, but it was either if you wear a mask, you're a part of a party. If you don't wear a mask, you're part of another party. Same with vaccinations. I understand that science needs to inform the policies, but is this going to be the new narrative that politicians are going to be sticking with, or how can we move away from that narrative to regain the trust in science of those who have lost that trust?
There's a lot there. Who wants to take that one?
Morton, you want to strike first? Well, we've already passed that point. I'm pushing, but it's not acting right here.
Thank you.
We're already past the point. I think many Republicans now feel that science is rigged, and that it is rigged in a way to try to promote democratic ideas. And so, it's going to be difficult to get back to let science lead.
There are times when I was in Congress, I thought there were a lot of members of Congress who were always trying to practice engineering without a license, or science without a degree. And so it's a never-ending battle. I think you're right. The ship has kind of sailed, but it just gets back down to just educating members about why you do what you do, and that some of the things that you do may not be, on the surface, not look particularly good. And we used to hand out those Golden Fleece Awards to show that, there's some research that kind of looks odd, just read about it, But when you dig a little deeper, you understand, oh, there's a real purpose to this. And I always said, you know, back in the day when they were trying to figure out a way to develop antivenom for snakes, and some guys doing research on horses, you know, somebody could have said, oh, this is a waste of money. Well, you got antivenom, right? But that could have been a politically sensitive issue back in the day when they first came up with the discoveries. But that's always the challenge. It's just easy to demagogue scientific research. It just kind of looks odd. You know, why you're looking at some obscure plant in South America, you know, a lot of money.
It's a tough one. I think, you know, learning about the scientific process, and I know this is a long-term solution, we have to make sure that folks in this country understand what the scientific process is. It's not like the professor on Gilligan's Island, right? The professor would fix the problem with a coconut and some seawater. We can't do that. What we have to do is we have to learn, we have to experiment, and then we change our minds. And we are open to changing our minds. And in the political realm, that's a flip-flop. In the scientific realm, that's just the learning of information. And we have to get that part about how's the scientific process actually work out in the world.
Right, that it's based on disproving, not making definitive statements about what actually exists. Our next questioner.
Hi. During the wonderful conversation, which I appreciate you having with us today, a lot of acronyms thrown around NSF/NIH, but there's a little one we forgot, right? Department of Defense, who is not only the largest funder of RDT&E, but also the largest portion of the discretionary budget. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about a little bit more about how that money is leveraged and how it can be included in the conversation today.
You talking about the health funding mostly, or which aspect of the
I mean,
research?
DoD funds all types of R&D, right?
Yeah, anything in particular? I mean, I don't know, I was not a defense appropriator, so I can't speak to it, but there's...
Lucky you.
Yeah, I know, I did military construction stuff, that was enough of a headache. But, you know, I've always got the sense every year that DoD research funding generally was supported by most members, even though there was usually some grousing. You know, why are they doing breast cancer research at DoD? Shouldn't NIH be doing that? Or, you know, that's what you're going to hear. Or melanoma, you pick the illness or the disease. There was always that question. But it never got off the ground, though. I mean, people would moan and complain about it a little bit, but then, you know, they just kind of roll over. I think that funding is generally pretty secure, but, you know, you have to be vigilant every year.
Yeah, and I think, as I previously said, I think because that funding is considered to be a national security priority, it makes it safer. And that's why many people focus on that. Oftentimes they'll say, it's the last train leaving the station, try to put everything on it, because you know that the NDAA is going to pass. And you know that gives a leg up for DoD approach. So I think it will be fairly safe in an atmosphere when not a lot of spending will be safe.
Yeah, that money is also a focus of games. So Democratic administrations tend to put forth a lower number in the president's budget for RDT&E at DoD. Boy, that is a lot of letters. But what ends up happening is they know the Congress is going to put it back and that they're going to actually increase it. So at the end of the year, you end up not with a 10% cut, but with a 10% increase. And I think that's likely to continue. The thing that is interesting is that funding has gone from being a lot of D, a lot of development, to really being a lot of really wonderful R as well, research. That is fueling NSF, that's fueling NIH as well. So it's something to be excited about in our planning for what we can invest in for research and development.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add, I think we have to be pragmatic in various pots of money. Jack Murtha, for political purposes, I think, as well as the right thing, put a lot of money in for breast cancer research. So there are funds there. I think the way it's going to have to be approached is how this is national security. The Defense Department will tell you that climate change is a national security issue. You know, if you have flooding in Bangladesh and a few million go next door, you know, that's a problem. So, and there are other many examples. So I think that you can use DoD funding for particularly deployment. There might be areas like storage and things of this nature where you need to have a bigger supply chain, and for their own security, DoD can come in and deploy various alternative energies that then can make it cheaper for others. You can make the same kind of case as the lady did earlier about if you have a disease that sweeps through some country and it have the instability can impact others. So it's not a complete honeypot, but it's a vehicle to put research and deployment into a national security concept, and it should be used whenever we can.
Just one quick thing on, on defense funding process. We were all taught when we were in school that the way Congress is supposed to work is that Congress is supposed to authorize programs and then fund them through the appropriations process. Well, it really doesn't work that way, except for defense, where it actually does work. We actually passed an authorization, an NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, and then we passed an appropriations bill that really largely tracks the authorization. It's remarkable, because most of Washington doesn't work that way. I mean, was there ever a State Department authorization passed? There was never a Homeland Security authorization passed, Justice Department? No, the appropriators fund it, but there's never an authorization. But in the defense world, it actually works the way we were told it was supposed to work as children. But everywhere else, it's all, it's all muddled.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else have any other questions from the audience?
Hi, I'm Mary Jevons-Mo with the Population Association of America. I am a habitual worrier, but I like to worry efficiently. So that's why I like to come to this session to help set the stage for what we can expect. So to that end, it's been a number of years since we've seen amendments offered on the House floor in particular, taking aim at peer-reviewed projects, NSF and NIH peer-reviewed projects. Is it time to start worrying about that again? Do we expect to see some attacks again on NIH and NSF peer review process?
No, I think the short answer is no. The reason I'll tell you, because you got very narrow majorities. Appropriations bills don't come to the floor the same way they used to. It was what's called an open rule, so they could offer all these amendments. No funds shall be expended for that research project that looks fishy. They don't do that anymore. They do a lot less of that. So those types of uncomfortable floor votes are less likely to happen, because they're going to put a bill on the floor with either not maybe a closed rule, but a very limited rule with a limited number of what they call a modified rule, actually, with a limited number of amendments. So those gotcha amendments, those are the ones that usually end up getting pushed aside, and they get a little more serious. So bottom line is, I think you're going to be better off, because you have a less open process, but that might actually work to your benefit in this case.
You can still get it in the Senate, though.
Anything can happen over there.
I'll keep worrying.
Yeah, because of spending, though, but they don't do appropriations bills really on the floor there anymore. They just like to do the negotiations and get it done.
That could be one of the concessions that people ask of McCarthy, just to open that process.
Oh, this don't get me going on this, Laura, because this used to drive me crazy. I used to say this to the Republican leadership. You can't have an open process and then a predetermined outcome at the end of this. Okay, if you're going to have an open process, you're going to get amendments, some you like, some you don't like, but then you vote for the bill. They pull bills off the floor because an amendment on LGBT rights was adopted. They have to pull the bill off. I said, open process, you're going to get things in that bill that, you got to vote for the bill. So they can't have it both ways. So this leadership's smart enough to know if they open up the process, they're going to get some things they don't like and they can't pass.
As we start to close out, I want to go back to the theme I mentioned earlier. This is going to be a very, I'm afraid, gridlock type of Congress, where you can find a Democrat, Republican that will want to work together. There will be breakthroughs. And I hesitate to say the Trump card. I'll just say the decisive card really is you and your various advocacy groups. I think it's hearing from home is going to help move the bipartisan effort to go forward. Anybody that wants to work together needs your help. So now is a great time for you to band together, get your folks at home, get agendas, and communicate that to Congress.
That perfectly segues into what I think will be our final question, but for all of you, what new members of Congress that are coming in have you guys identified that might become a champion of pro-science? And more generally, do you have advice for those in the audience about how to approach and engage new members? Charlie?
Well, I have to give it some thought, but the one who's coming in from the Republican side, Tom Kaine Jr. of New Jersey, I think he's going to be very receptive to a lot of your issues. Being from the state of New Jersey, it's a big pharmaceutical powerhouse, so I think he's going to be very attuned to like issues of NIH and health research, medical research. That's just one that comes to my mind immediately. I have to sit down and look at the list who's coming. I'm still not sure what their backgrounds all are, but that's one that just jumps out at me immediately on the Republican side.
Yeah, I think most of the Democrats that you've seen elected are going to be champions of science funding. I think on the Republican side, one interesting person that I think we should look to, with the loss of Senator Portman, that was a huge champion for science and research. His replacement, J.D. Vance, is somebody that I hope organizations here and elsewhere will get to earlier and talk to about continuing that championship for the state of Ohio, for your researchers there, for your universities, and really making the case to him because he could be a powerful continuation of that Republican advocacy.
Yeah, I'll have to punt on the new members, but what I will say is that we have folks who have not necessarily been at the tip of the spear, who are going to have to be at the tip of the spear in the appropriations process. Folks like Senator Collins, who, although always supportive, was never at the tip of the spear for NIH, but now she can and will be. Folks like Jerry Moran, who can and will be at the tip of the spear. So these are different names, right? We used to say Boyd Blunt, before that Arlen Specter, before that Tom Harkin. We need to make sure that generation continues, the next generation is just as strong at the tip of the spear.
I think I was in my third or fourth, maybe even fifth term before Congressman Ross Gronkowski knew my name. And he called me Bert. There's not going to be a lot of new members coming in making a lot of waves. But to Mary, credit for lots of things. Mary is working with a group that's trying to identify those new members, trying to educate them and get them ready to go. If I had to identify someone, I would say that the new senator from Pennsylvania probably has a more sensitive interest in healthcare now than he did before. So that would be a good champion. And then on sort of let's warm up some of the the existing team. As I mentioned earlier, Frank Lucas from Oklahoma will be the new chairman of the Science Committee. Frank he was chairman of Ag before. I really think he's a good legislator. Zoe Lofgren will probably be the ranking member, taking in Bernice Johnson's place. She is solid.
Who did you say I didn't? Who's the lead ranking?
Zoe Lofgren. Yeah. So I think those two working together could be a very good team on the science, space, and committee.
But I agree with what Sudhir said too about Susan Collins and Jerry Moran. They are going to be two key players, and I found them to be very good to work with over the years, by the way.
And I think that does it for our panel. Thank you to Research America. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and I'll hand it over to Mary.
Thank you, Laura. Let's give a round of applause. Thank you all, and appreciate the continuing opportunity to work with you and be guided by your leadership. Thank you. So I also want to give a thank you to the Research America staff that put this program together, led by Sheila Murphy and Sarah Chan. We've got our work cut out for us. I mean, all of us. We are, Bart mentioned that we are taking a look at and will be working to engage freshman members. Many of you are probably doing exactly the same thing. We want to coordinate that. It's much more effective if we can coordinate. We still have a lot of work to do in the lame duck. We're optimistic, cautiously so, but we are optimistic. And you can look to us to be right there at the tip of the spear with all those leaders who themselves are, for sure. So thank you very much for being our partners always, for being here today, if you're able to come in person, and for joining us virtually. Please stay in touch. There's much more ahead. And working together, we can achieve exactly what we want to, which is giving science, technology, discovery, and innovation every chance. It deserves it, it can do it, and with all of us working together, we'll make it happen. Thank you.